EJIL has always prided itself as being innovative, and some years ago, as all of you listening or watching this will know, we started EJIL Talk, which is our blog, and of which we are very proud. It creates a conversation and an EJIL community, which the journal alone would not sustain. And what we are doing now is to create something we are calling EJIL Live, which will accompany each new issue of the journal and will include, among other things, an interview featuring one of the authors and one of the articles in a recent issue of EJIL. I have here with me Dr. Maria Aristodemou, who will have published in the first issue of 2014 an article called A Constant Craving for Fresh Brains and a Taste for Decaffeinated Neighbours. Now, I am going to assume that some of you listening or watching this will have read the articles, will have read this article, and might have a lot of questions to pose to the author, and I'm going to try and be your proxy. And for those of you who have not read it, maybe this will be a trailer or an appetizer to incite you to read it. Obviously, the fact that we published it makes us believe that this is very well worth reading and thinking about, different as it is from the mainstream. Maybe I can give those who haven't read it a taste of it. The way the article is structured is that Maria, if I may, and you can call me Joseph, Maria has taken a classical case from the annals of psychoanalysis, a case which is described by the psychoanalyst Chris, and which was later commented on and critiqued and become foundational by Lacan, and a way to understand and enter into Lacanian psychoanalytical thinking. And she presents the case, and then she uses it not just as a metaphor, but actually as an explanatory apparatus to some features of public international law. So we will talk a little bit about the substance of the case in a few minutes, but on a more personal level, maybe you can tell us a little bit about your background. How did you get to write this kind of article? We get a lot of submissions at EJIL, but this is one that, even for us, is a little bit out of the ordinary.
I guess there has always been a sort of identification between me and my subject, in the sense that if I portray public international law as a hysterical subject, in the sense that a hysteric in the Lacanian dogma is someone who doesn't know what their desire is, but looks for other people to find out what their desire should be. So a hysteric's desire is always the desire of someone else. And I guess my own desire, I see myself as a hysterical subject in the sense that I look, like all of us, to other people, other disciplines, other institutions, to find out what we should want, how we should live, how we should go about our business. But I find international law suited me, and I identified with it because I feel it has the same problem. Traditionally, it's never been sure of its place. It's always looking elsewhere to find a source for its legitimacy, its raison d'être. So I think out of all the subjects in legal discourse, international law best exemplifies the nature of hysterical desire. Its identity, such as it is, it's more obviously an identity that is based on identifications with other things, other people, other disciplines. So I'm saying in the article and elsewhere that is the nature of identity anyway. All our identity is always borrowed from bits of other people. But in international law, it's even more blatant, much more obvious, because it cannot hide the fact that is a collection of bits of other discourses, and particularly theology, politics, religion, as well as mainstream law. So it best exemplifies my argument that identity is always a series of identifications, often false identifications. There's never a sort of solid identity. In fact, we only have a solid identity when we die. The death mask, in some respects, is the final print. That's when we can say it's a closed identity.
Just before we continue on the substance, and your background is as a psychoanalyst, as a psychologist, what's the background you bring to this?
Okay. My own background, I'm a lawyer. I studied law. I studied public international law at Cambridge. And I guess I'm from Cyprus, yes? Cyprus as a nation, if you like, as a country, is itself riddled by problems of identification. It's always had a history of being colonized and occupied, and that history continues and is unresolved. So in the same way that I suggested, I was finding some kind of identification in the hysterical nature of international law. The fact that I am Cypriot, and Cyprus has always been uncertain of its identity. Is it part of Greece? Is it its own nation? Has made me to look for international law for some kind of answers, or for some kind of... so therefore I studied international law. I started teaching law very early on. I started teaching at Bristol University, and now I'm at Birkbeck. But I never found that legal discourse was satisfying enough for addressing problems that legal discourse itself threw up. So I started looking at literature as a way of opening up the categories of truths and that we can address in order to find out what the law is. I started looking at literature in particular. So my first major work, to date my only major work, was on law and literature. And the argument there was that law is a kind of elaborate, majestic, very impressive palace, but it's also a kind of labyrinth where those inside it get lost, those outside it find it very forbidding to enter. Yes, and in particular in my book on law and literature, the main thread was that if there's one group of subjects that find it hard to enter the legal labyrinth or have been deliberately excluded, have been women. So my address of literature was a way of letting women into the legal labyrinth. The idea was that literature, a wedding between law and literature, was more likely to open up the doors of this legal labyrinth to women. The idea, it was a metaphor inspired from a short story by Jorge Luis Borges, where he portrays the labyrinth in a way that makes you feel sorry for the Minotaur. The Minotaur inside is not the monster to be feared, but to be pitied. And my argument in the book, I imagine the legal labyrinth, the legal Minotaur, as being actually quite lonely. It's been forbidding all these other subjects, especially women, from entering, but it's consigned itself to a life of boredom, loneliness. So in some respects, the entry of literature and of women into the legal labyrinth is not just good for women, but it's also good for the lawyer who has lost himself inside the labyrinth. I mean, that was the beautiful metaphor in Borges, where the Minotaur is lost in his own labyrinth. So that was the background where I was allowing literature in. That was a long time ago. Then I realized also, shortly afterwards, I mean, that was when I was young. And the book, at least that book, ended in a very optimistic celebration of this so-called sort of union between law and literature.
Tell our listeners or our viewers the title of the book.
Oh, it was called Law and Literature, Journeys from Here to Eternity. So
And it was published
by Oxford University Press.
And when?
In 2000.
In 2000.
A long time ago. So it took me time to assimilate the message I had arrived at, but also its consequences. And several years older than I am now, I realized that that marriage was not necessarily, the honeymoon didn't last. I mean, it lasted enough, but like all marriages, it started showing problems. And
that's an interesting statement about marriages.
Well,
I'm just teasing, go ahead.
Yes, well, okay, the problem I perceived, and I perceive in marriages for what it's worth, in all unions, is that if law in that particular project fell in love with literature fell in love with law, the problem in this kind of unions, and I think it applies to human subjects, not just disciplines, is that we end up idealizing the other person or the other discipline to such an extent that we give up or we stop interrogating our own limitations. The whole point, I think in human subjects as well as in looking for other disciplines, is that when I fall in love with someone, or law fell in love with literature, as in my book, the idea was that, okay, law excludes women, law doesn't take in emotions, law doesn't take in the other, law marginalizes non-white, Western, middle-class men, or whatever, yes? Now, I can look at literature, and all those excluded voices can suddenly be represented. If I allow literature into law, all those excluded voices can be represented. Now, the problem with that kind of...
although the same critique has been made of literature.
Yes,
that it excludes exactly the same voices, etc.
Precisely, exactly. So that was one of the problems. That was the main problem, that you idealize literature to the extent that you forget that literature is itself ideological. It has its own exclusions, its own problems. But also, it does conveniently enable the law and the lawyers to continue to ignore what is wrong with the law and with the legal structure. In other words, we put the hard work of including those voices onto the shoulders of literature, which enables me to carry on being the same old legalistic lawyer as I always were. Do you see? So, and this happens, I think, as you pointed out, in marriages, and it's where you expect the other person to complete you, to make up for what is lacking in you. And the result is that you end up ignoring your own limitations.
So that's
doing nothing about them.
That's in some ways one of the very central points in your article. Because you describe the classical KISS case of the author who is afraid that what he's writing is plagiarism and therefore he can never write. And you come to the same conclusion. So just in 2 or 3 minutes, describe the case that KISS presents, and then we'll talk about Lacan's critique.
Yes. Okay, it's a beautiful case that I think any academic is always taken in with. And it took me a long time to work out what was going on and why Lacan was so obsessed with it, because Lacan kept going back again and again to the case and gave different cutting critiques of it. But okay, the case takes place in 1950s New York, where many of Freud's followers, including Ernst Kriess, had found refuge after the Second World War, or during the Second World War. And according to Lacan, and not just Lacan actually, this is well known among psychoanalysts generally, they took with them to New York and to the United States generally a version of Freud that Freud would not have been happy with. I mean, if you remember when Freud arrived in New York with Jung, supposedly this apocryphal anecdote supposedly goes that Freud turned to Jung and said to him, all these Americans are welcoming us because they don't realize that we are bringing them the plague. And sure enough, the history of what happened to Freudian psychoanalysis in the United States confirms Freud's prediction that they did not want to take in the plague. What they ended up doing is take the sweet bits of Freud, or they sweetened it, they domesticated it. So the radical message and the subversive message ushered in by psychoanalysis, Freudian psychoanalysis, was completely ignored.
But let's maybe go back to describe to our viewers and listeners very briefly the actual case itself before we get into the family feuds among the psychoanalysts.
I know, it's very hard to get away from them because they are, the Oedipal struggle is everywhere. Okay, so Ernst Kris was an academic. No, not Ernst Kris, the patient whose name we never know, was an academic who had great difficulty in publishing his work. And as we know, if you're an academic, obviously you want to publish your work, otherwise it's not good for your career. Now, the reason why he was reluctant to publish his work was not just that he was plagued by good, normal insecurities, that his work was not ready, it wasn't good enough, he needed to work further, which is fair enough, we should all be at that stage. But in his case, it was an even more demanding inhibition, whereby he assumed that everything he ever wrote was already a plagiarism of existing work by other people. So every time he was on the verge of publishing something, he would decide that it had already been written, he was only plagiarizing something that had already been written, so he would stop himself from publishing. And he enters analysis with Ernst Kris in part to overcome this inhibition. Now, Ernst Kris listens to him, session after session, and finds out during the course of these sessions that this particular patient had a grandfather who was already a very famous scientist and had published many things in the past. Anyway, he listens to the session, he finds out more about the patient, until one day the patient arrives and announces that he has actually finished something and that he is ready to publish it. So Kris is thrilled. Finally, he thinks some progress is being made. Sure enough, however, next session, the patient returns only to announce to Kris, and note he announces to his analyst Kris in a very excited way, which is very suspicious for Kris. He's announcing that, sorry, that paper I told you about last week that I finished and I was about to publish, absolute rubbish. It's a plagiarism of another work by someone else. I must have read it because it's already in the library, and I have, so really, all my enthusiasm is back to square one. I haven't published anything new. So Kris is surprised that the patient is suddenly pleased in some respects, that he has proved himself to be a plagiarist after all. So Kris does something that later Lacan criticizes heavily, where Kris, the analyst,
he actually checks whether it was published, and he discovers that it's a figment of the patient's imagination.
Exactly.
There was no published, it wasn't plagiarism.
Exactly.
And then Kris works towards a conclusion.
Yes, he announces to the patient that I've checked the two papers, you haven't plagiarized the earlier paper, so go away, you are not a plagiarist, you can publish it. So the patient goes away, and as he's about to leave the session where it's been announced to him that he's not a plagiarist, he turns to his analyst, Kris, and says to him, you know, every time I leave the sessions, I go to such and such a street, and it's a street where is well known in New York for having a line of beautiful bijou restaurants. And the patient says, I look through the menus of those restaurants until I find my preferred dish. And my preferred dish is fresh brains. So basically, the patient who thinks he's a plagiarist, on being told that he is not a plagiarist, that he does have fresh brains of his own, when he leaves the session, goes in search of fresh brains in the flesh. He actually wants to eat them, literally. So in psychoanalysis, this would be called an acting out. He's been told he's not a plagiarist, so he says, I'm still going to go and eat fresh brains. I still need fresh brains. So the treatment has not worked. He's still after fresh brains, this time in the flesh.
And then there's a kind of sequel with the grandfather.
Okay, yes. So this is the Chris's interpretation, which is an interpretation that Lacan is not unhappy about. He confirms that this was the real problem with this particular patient. And this was the fact that what the patient was doing all this time was preventing himself from publishing because publishing something would have meant that he was coming into conflict with his famous grandfather, in other words, etymologically, the father who is great. So he would have been competing in terms of quality with his great father. So in short, what the patient was doing was protecting himself from engaging in the Oedipal struggle. He was protecting himself from entering in the good old Oedipal struggle by using the defense of plagiarism as a defense against coming into conflict. So plagiarism suited him very well. He'd never publish anything, which means he would never come into conflict with his great father, his grandfather. So this is
now,
a good
and then the next move in our analysis is to generalize the situation, right? And say this is not just a particularistic instant of this patient, but it says something about the human condition itself.
Exactly.
And the human condition itself, it's a proxy for what?
The human, well, for Freud, obviously, the Oedipal struggle is endemic. It's part of our, it's what we all undergo in order to become subjects. We all have to go through some kind of Oedipal process, more or less successfully, mostly unsuccessfully, but the failure is what the way we fail, and we all fail one way or the other, but that failure is what constitutes us as subjects. So there's no getting away from the loss inflicted from us, from the Oedipal struggle. At some point, we have to go through the Oedipal struggle and lose something. For Lacan, what we lose is something that is inflicted by language. For Freud, it was more metaphorical. It was the so-called castration inflicted by a forbidding father. But what's important is a lot of people who are not familiar with psychoanalysis are not, they sort of have a problem the minute you mention the word castration. What's important to recognize is that castration doesn't mean literal cutting off of an anatomical piece of us. It's actually a metaphor for loss. We lose something. We have to get used to it. We have to lose something in order to become subjects. And in fact, it's that loss that defines us as subjects. So we shouldn't be expecting, as we're going back to our earlier discussion, that at some point we'll recover this loss and we look to other people when we get married or fall in love, or to other disciplines when we indulge in interdisciplinary in order to make up for that loss. That loss is endemic. Forget about it. It will always be lost.
And now maybe tell us the essence of the Lacan critique of the KISS interpretation, or the KISS approach even.
For Lacan, The problem with Chris's treatment of the patient is that Chris takes the patient at their word and enters into the patient's imaginary, what Lacan calls the imaginary register, and tries to cure the patient at the level of the patient's ego. In other words, when the patient says, I'm a plagiarist, the analyst takes him at his word and goes and checks whether the work produced by the patient is indeed a work of plagiarism. Now, for Lacan, the last thing the analyst should do is meet the patient at the level of the patient's ego. What Lacan insisted and what he thought was wrong with the way psychoanalysis was received in the States was that they took the be-all and end-all of Freud's technique as being focused on treating the ego. Now, for Lacan, the ego is purely imaginary. It's a misrecognition. From the moment we encounter ourselves in the mirror stage when we are like 12 months old or less or more, what we see ourselves is always a misrecognition. The last thing the analyst should do is enter the patient's imaginary and address their ego, because the ego itself is a misrecognition. And what Lacan pointed out and noticed was happening in ego psychology versions of Freud was that what the analyst ended up doing was to try and rectify the patient's ego, which meant, in effect, that they were trying to make the patient after their own image, after the analyst's own image. I mean, the analyst has their ego as well. The analyst's ego is also imaginary. If I'm an analyst and I'm trying to cure a patient's ego, what I end up doing is make the patient's ego in the image of my ego.
And what would Lacan instead have the analyst do?
Devastate the subject. The Lacanian analyst will be really nasty, will not protect or defend or sympathize or save the patient, but destroy the patient. Destroy the patient's ego in order to create it anew, in order for it to be created anew. I mean, the analyst doesn't do it, but what the patient will do it by themselves if they keep talking. But what the analyst must refrain from doing is what Chris did, where you go and say, there's nothing wrong with your work. That's the last thing an Lacanian analyst would do. It would be, yeah.
So now, those of our listeners or viewers who have not read the article in EJIL are waiting at this point. Tell us how you translate this, how you use this for your analysis of international law.
Okay. Well,
because until this point, they
haven't talked much about international law.
They are looking at me and saying, you're the editor-in-chief, why did you publish this piece? So,
oops. I hope not.
No.
Okay.
So how do we move from the case as a metaphor or an explanation or an insight into international law?
Okay. Well, I see international law as the typical neurotic patient after the image of Ernst Chris's patient, who is hysterically looking around to make up for their deficiencies by imitating, copying, trying to be like other disciplines. And this is, looking at various approaches to international law. I suggest this is because international law, like any subject, like any discipline, is plagued by a lack at its center. Just like we said the human subject is, so is every discipline. Now, the good thing about international law is that the lack is obvious. It's much more obvious than it is for domestic law. But it doesn't mean that the lack can never be filled by looking at other disciplines or other ways of doing things. And I think with international law, even more clearly than for other areas of law, although it's still the case for them, this big other, this great grandfather that we saw in Ernst Kries's patient's case, in international law is this big other of God.
You say is God?
Yes. The aim is to fill the gap that was once upon a time filled by the omniscient divinity, the entity that knew everything, legislated everything, owned the universe, owned the earth, owned every territory, legislated. And with the so-called death of God in modernity, this gap is more blatantly empty than it ever was before. What I'm saying is that the gap was always there. It's not like, this is a beautiful way of putting it by a Portuguese poet called Pessoa, where he says, when God supposedly departed with the advent of modernity, the gap was obvious for all of us to see. And therefore, we had to start filling it in with rules. Kant's categorical imperative is the one that I focus on in this article. But this was the case in every area of law, not just international law. But the thing is, God was always ever a screen for hiding the gap. The gap was always there. So when modern man, or modern man rather than modern woman, as we know, supposedly killed God, the gap became much more obvious, much more, because it was left empty. God did a really good job of filling it.